Hi everyone, I'm back and I brought some friends with me this time. So just to pick up where I left off before, as I was saying, reference populations are critical in our ability to deliver genomic breeding values, to be able to use genomics. Ideally, where we would like to be able to get to is not just having a reference population that allows us to inform the stud breeding industry, which flows on to the commercial sector, but then being able to pick up information from the processing sector, objective carcass measurement, the MSA grading information Sarah is talking about, also what consumers think of the product, and then feed that back into our inform our reference population, so we complete the feedback loop and can make use of that information to go back into our breeding program. So ideally that's where we want to get to. As an example of what we've been working on, we were going to go through in detail the resource flock that's behind the use of genomics in the sheep genetic evaluations. We are obviously working on exactly the same thing on the beef side of things with a number of different projects, but we thought we'd work through this one as a bit of an example of how we're doing that work. So our reference population for sheep did start out in around 2005-2006 with the first of the sheep genomics flock projects. Went on then to be run through the sheep CRC as the information nucleus flock for 5 years, where we saw around 18,000 lambs measured. About 10,000 of those lambs go through to carcass records out of that project. Since 2012, we've picked that up and have been running it through MLA as the resource flock. So the first round of that has collected around information on around 15,000 lambs, 10,000 of those again with measurements for carcass and eating quality traits. We're just starting on the next phase of that now, again capturing eating quality and carcass information, but also working with producers to measure a whole bunch of reproductive data as well, so we can utilise genomic predictions for reproductive traits. So we're still running those sites at Armidale, just up the hill here. Katanning in Western Australia are the two biggest sites. There is a satellite site at Tamora, and as I said, we will be running a few smaller projects as an overlay to that with individual breeders to capture reproductive data as well. Across that project, we're aiming to represent the sort of genetics that you see out in the commercial industry. So a range of different breeds reflecting commercial production systems as much as we can, split across the terminal, maternal and merino breed groups. Aiming to represent around 150 sires in that project every year. It's not a traditional progeny test. You don't need a whole heap of progeny from each sire. It's to capture genomic information, so we're better off with a lot more sires with a few progeny each. In terms of the traits that we're recording, the on-farm traits, clearly recording all of the growth curve information from birth through to post-weaning, ultrasound scan information, parasite burdens, reproductive rates. On the carcass side of things, lean meat yield, shear force, intramuscular fat and so on. So across the life of all of those projects so far, our reference population for the sheep genetic evaluations is sitting close to 38,000 animals that have got measurements and genotypes, with just over 20,000 of those with carcass and eating quality information. So why are we really doing this? What's behind it? Over time, and with that data we've now collected, we've been able to see what changes we have made over time to carcass and eating quality traits while we've been selecting for correlated traits. So our selection for more growth, more muscle and so on has certainly had a positive impact on our carcass weights, shown by the blue line there, and lean meat yield, shown by the orange or red, whatever that colour is. So we know that we're making positive progress on those productivity traits, but at the same time, we haven't been able to measure tenderness, which we're now looking at using the shear force trait, or intramuscular fat as two of our key guides to eating quality. So over that period of time, our shear force has gone up. So it's harder to cut through a piece of meat, At the same time, we've seen intramuscular fat slowly trending off in the wrong direction. So not massively. Lamb is still in a good position for eating quality, but the writing's on the wall. If we keep that trend line up, we will fall below the benchmarks that our consumers tell us they want to see. So what do we do about it? If you can't measure a trait, you can't manage the trait. So this work is about measuring that information so people can start selecting directly for it. So on that note, I would like to invite Pete McGilchrist to join me.
Thanks, Hamish. And it's fantastic to be here in Tamworth this morning for Red Meat 2019.
So, Pete, you're, I believe, nearly a Tamworth local?
Yeah, well, grew up just down the highway here in a little town called Wallabitar. No one's probably heard of it. There's only a couple of people there. But yeah, it's fantastic to be back in the thick of it here in the New England.
Okay, excellent. So what sort of role are you doing now?
Yeah, I work at the University of New England in Armidale, just up the hill, in a teaching and research role. So I lecture to animal science, rural science, agribusiness type students and conduct research right across the value chain in all aspects of our industry that affect the end product or the product that gets to our consumers. So really working on anything that affects the eating quality of that beef and lamb for the consumer. So
the audience may not have picked up just yet. You're the sort of bloke who gets really excited about red meat.
You don't get to be 6'3" eating tofu. I give you the tip.
So what is it that global consumers think about our product?
Yeah, look, domestically and across the globe, our consumers love Australian product. You know, we export 70-odd% of beef and nearly the same now in lamb. And we've tested beef across 12 different countries and lamb across America and China as well. And basically, the consumers line up in all those countries. So the best sample here is often the best sample in other countries, and the worst is the worst. And there's very little re-ranking that goes on across consumers. So our prediction system not only works for our domestic customers, but for all our export customers as well.
It's good news. So we produce some great products. Can you tell us about what some of the drivers of carcass values actually are?
Yeah, carcass value is actually quite a simple one. It's actually the amount of red meat we can sell from the carcass multiplied by the quality or the value we get for that meat. So yeah, it's quite simple.
Yeah, okay. So our yield traits around what we're doing quantity-wise, but we need to keep an eye on our quality indicators for value of that product. Can you tell me a little bit about the MSA eating quality prediction work?
Yeah, so for MSA and beef is obviously well established, but the prediction of eating quality is like, we use predictions every day, and the Bureau meteorologists do a good job of it, maybe not. But they use a lot of historical data to help them predict, that today's going to be hot and sunny. Tomorrow's going to be hotter and sunny. And just like meteorologists, we use predictors from a carcass that we can measure and see to predict that as a grill, that piece of shoulder will be, 4-star or 3-star or 2-star or 5-star. So the prediction system is exactly the same. So where we get that historic data from for meat is through feeding it to consumers and gathering that information on meat from animals that we know everything about.
Sure. So clearly I managed the genetics program. Can you tell me how many of those traits actually have a genetic basis to them?
Yeah, the good thing about it, as you pointed out before, that genetic increases are compound. So the traits we put into the systems in both beef and sheep is IMF or marbling. We look at growth, so we measure that in beef in ossification. So getting the animal to slaughter as young as we possibly can reduces that collagen content and improves the tenderness of that. So we've got those two, and obviously fatness and carcass weight. And in lamb also yield affects eating quality as well as a predictor of eating quality. So yeah, we've got quite a number of traits that are genetically controlled. Yep,
okay. So I think for traits like lean meat yield and intramuscular fat, quite highly heritable, up above 50%, I believe. But that still means that nutrition does have a role to play, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that nutrition has a big impact and often bigger than the size of the genetic impact. But we can change our management from this year to next year, but it takes time to change our genetics. So we have to work on that incremental shift.
Okay, so we know these traits are important to our consumers. We know, therefore, they're going to have an impact on our profitability, but they're hard to measure at home. You know, it's a bit hard for producers to measure them. They're expensive. How do we then go about getting that information into a genetic evaluation?
Yeah, it's quite hard to do it on your breeding stock as well because they don't breed on so well after we measure them on the hook. So that's where the resource flock really comes into its own. And so we've got a genetically very diverse group. You showed the number of sire types there. And they're all born together, raised together, and then harvested together. So we take control of that environmental effect so we can really hone in on the genetic effect, and there's a bit of maternal effect there as well that we can account for in the analysis.
Sure. So what sort of phenotypic ranges are we seeing?
Yeah, well, I've got some pictures here of some of the lambs that we harvested this year, and be it a less than optimal year in the New England, these guys they've had a bit jammed down their throats. But you can see here some loins, so we've cut the side of those loins so we can get the near infrared camera in there to look at marbling. But you can see they're pretty similar marbling in those two, but one is much fattier and lower yielding than the others. These are all harvested together, born together. Again, some loins there. And this is one I just pulled off the line at the abattoir, but you can see the variation in those came across the line very similar, those bottom two. Just the waste in fat in some of those. So getting heavy lambs isn't just all about genetics. We've got to have the right genetics in there to get them that heavy.
And what sort of variation are you seeing in actual measurements of those traits of interest?
So we see some cracking loins, and I'm not saying this is where we need to go, but I just love this loin. So it's high yielding, and as a meat scientist, we get very excited about that sort of quality as well. But if we move on to have a look at some of the phenotypic data for some of the traits here, you can see across the bottom there we've got intramuscular fat percentage. This is for our last kill group of lambs we had this year against lean meat yield. And you can all appreciate the relationship between those two traits is next to zero. That's the shotgun approach. So we don't have a very strong correlation between those. So we can harvest these animals that are high in marbling and also high in yield. They exist in these kill groups we're looking at. And so my job and for the industry is really about measuring these traits so we as producers can harness that variability to breed the next generation of rams going forward. In terms of the relationship between intramuscular fat and sea-site fat, you would think as one fat depot goes up, the other fat depot goes up. Certainly does on my body. But you can see there again, the relationship between those two traits is next to zero. So just because they're fat on the loin doesn't mean they've got lots of IMF. So again, we need these animals that have the right amount of fat to maximise the yield, but also have the right amount of fat to maximise eating quality. If we look one further, this is a relationship between eye muscle depth, so the circularity of that loin and the intramuscular fat. There's next to no relationship there either when we look phenotypically. And nothing gets me excited more than being able to see no relationship, because we can really harness those animals that give us both traits at the same time.
Well, I hadn't been going to mention your fat depots, Pete, but I can't help but notice that the fat depots are the higher numbers than I was expecting. The sheep fat depots, that is, not yours.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
What can you tell me about those, the actual magnitude of some of those numbers?
Yeah, look, this data here from our last kill group this year, these lambs have been on feed for a lot of their life, about 6 or 7 months. And these ones were killed at 11 months of age. So the intramuscular fat we're seeing there is not what we're all targeting, but the beauty is when we feed lambs for a long time in the seasonal conditions we had, we can really see the variation that we can express due to genetics there. So, and I've got not that any of you can see that, but I've put it up there, and there's some in the retail meat space out the back here, and you can have a look at, these are some lamb loins from this kill this year, and you can see that these are lambs that were born together, raised together, harvested together, and just the magnitude of variation across that kill group. You know, in this group here, we've got from 3.8% IMF and 55% yield on the top left, down to the bottom there of over 12% IMF and still 53% yield. So, you know, we're not all aiming at that bottom left, but what it shows is that we can have our cake and eat it too in these lambs.
Yeah, so I guess it gives us a way of being able to measure something that we haven't been able to measure previously, and look at the relationship between quality and productivity traits. So I guess, you know, this project's shown that there's a lot of variation out there in industry for those traits that we wouldn't have been able to measure otherwise. We now know that not only is there a lot of variation, it's high heritability, so we can certainly make progress for it. This gives us a way of measuring animals for those phenotypes, taking DNA samples on them, so we can get them into that single-step analysis where we're using performance measurements, pedigree and genotypes all at the same time, and then looking at the genomic relationship between animals in industry and those that we've measured, so we can actually predict what genes are carrying and then how that is likely to be expressed in the progeny. So.
Yeah, that's right. So you take this data from us and work the magic, and from that we get the ASBVs, and we've got here on the screen the relationship in the of Sire ASBVs who have had lambs in the resource flock, and I think this is the terminal analysis, but we've got PFAT there across the x-axis and intramuscular fat on the y-axis. And again, you can see that the relationship between those two isn't as strong now as what it would have been in the past. And so if you know, I know fat is important in the system, but you can see at any level of PFAT that's right for your system to get your ewes back in lamb, etc., there's a big variation in IMF that exists at any level of IMF. So we can harness that variability and pull those two fat depots apart if we want to, so we can have the sheep of the future, which is probably high yielding and high quality at the same time, plus does the right thing on farm. If we have a look at the relationship between lean meat yield and IMF in exactly those same rams, the trend is a little bit stronger there. So as lean meat yield goes up, IMF comes down. But hey, have a look at those ones in the top right-hand quadrant. You know, they're the sires that are really bucking the trend here, that we can get a high-yielding, high-quality progeny from. Now, does that suit everyone's system? I can't answer that. So animals have still got to be very fit for farm and suitable for market. But the market of the future is probably going to demand that lamb that's high quality and high yielding in exactly the same article.
Yeah, sure. So other than the other than the lab measurements that we're currently looking at, what other work's going on to tell us about what consumers think of product?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of sensory testing on not only the loin, these are some loins there from the animals this year, but sensory testing. The mouth is one of the most powerful measurement systems that we can use. Yes, consumers are variable, but the average of consumers is very easy to predict. So we've, out of these resource flock lambs, we've put a whole bunch through the CT scanner to work out exact yields, and then we've eaten loins and topsides, silver sides, rumps, shoulders, racks, a whole lot of cuts out of those lambs to find out about the tenderness, juiciness, flavour of those lambs. So here's some my team cutting up some samples of which, you know, each piece from each lamb gets eaten by 10 consumers. So that consumer work's very important for us.
Okay, so what other traits do you think might be of importance that we might want to start looking at into the future?
Yeah, so at the moment we use predictors that we can see and measure, like rib fat and carcass weight and IMF. Well, some would beg to differ that we can't measure that just yet, but in the future, I think through projects like the Advanced Livestock Measurement Technologies project, we should continue to search for new traits like collagen content, and we need technologies, and some bright young people in the room might be able to help us with this quest. I mean, bright, everyone, whoever, I don't care. We need technologies to help us measure these traits we can't see, maybe collagen content, sarcomere length, you name it, enzyme levels, those sort of things will help us continually improve our accuracy of prediction going forward. So, yeah, it's an exciting time to produce beef, and our consumers will be thankful.
Okay, excellent. I'll have to move on to Troy, otherwise Troy won't get a chance to say anything. But first, Troy, thank you for deciding to sit down, because we all look a lot more like the same height. But could you just tell me a little bit about your business?
Thanks, Hamish. Thanks for the opportunity. So I'm from South Australia. I run a farming business with my wife, Nettie. We run stud white Suffolks and a cropping business in the mid-north, as you can see on the map. We've been involved in performance recording and land plan for just on 25 years. And essentially our job, as we see it, is to breed rams that improve profitability for our clients. So we're looking at traits like growth, carcass value traits like lean meat yield and muscle, and sort of easy care traits as well. So lambing ease, birth weight, worm egg count, that sort of stuff.
Sure. So have you got some examples you can share with us about how useful genetic tools, ASBVs, have been for your clients to this point?
Yeah, I do. I sure do. So one example that springs to mind is essentially speed to turn off weight of lambs. So we've had several clients who've been purchasing rams with no data and really struggling to do a job on their lambs. So it's a winter system. They'll lamb in winter. They should be finished in spring, but they're not. They're not ready, not meeting target weights. So they get shorn and fed grain over summer. So a really lengthy, drawn out, low efficient system. Started buying rams with data, with numbers, not necessarily the best rams. And in their first year, 90% of the lambs are turned off as suckers, straight off mum, 10% shorn. So essentially, for no more financial outlay, they've really changed the system, made it more efficient, more profitable. It's like a free kick.
Sure. So what sort of changes have you seen over time in how your clients are using this data and how much attention they're paying to it?
Well, essentially, we run through the auction system, and we're really seeing strong relationship between merit and price. So the higher merit animals are getting, we're getting paid more for them, and that relationship is getting stronger year on year. So it's stronger now than it was 10 years ago, and I suspect in 10 years' time it'll be really even more so. So that tells me that our clients are valuing the data and putting the money where their mouth is, and actually spending more money on the higher merit animals.
Okay, so what about genomics? How and why are you using genomics? What problem are you trying to solve?
So genomics is really opening a window into performance of an animal at a young age. So we can get prediction of performance for traits that we can't actually measure on our rams, like some of the meat traits that Pete was talking about, and that really opens up opportunities as to which rams you might breed from that 5 or 10 years ago just weren't possible. In terms of the problem we're, I guess, trying to address, it's the crux of it is that slide with that steady eating quality erosion that you talked about, Hamish. 20 years of selecting for faster growth, more muscle. There's been some compromise along the way, and I guess genomics is going to help us reverse that trend.
Mm-hmm. So what about genomic tools? Why are they important to stud breeders like yourself?
Well, like I said, they're basically an early predictor of performance for traits that are either expensive to measure or impossible to measure in the case of the carcass traits. It's technology that's been talked about for it's been in the pipeline for a couple of decades, and I'd say over the last 5 years we're really starting to harness that technology and starting to address some of these antagonisms. So finding animals that have high performance and are good for these meat quality traits, whereas we haven't been able to do that in the past.
Yeah, okay. And I believe you've been involved in a small-scale project yourself to test it out? Yes.
This project?
That one?
Yeah. So essentially, I'm involved in a breeding group called Superwhites. It's a cooperative of ram breeders across Australia, and our goal was to really speed up the rate of progress in these eating quality traits. So we set about measuring a couple thousand ram lambs for genotyping, and we saw an accuracy increase of about 5 to 10%, which doesn't sound like much, but essentially what that does is increases the spread of the data in those lambs and gives us more opportunity to select at the top end, and I'll show a graph of what that actually looks like in reality. On the other side of the project, we did some slaughter work, including with Pete. So we slaughtered cull females across a range of breeder flocks. They're fully pedigreed, fully performance recorded animals that got their heads cut off. And what we saw there was a really large jump in sire accuracy, up to 20% or more, which is quite exciting as a ram breeder. And what happened when that data went into the system was even more variation in those rams that were selection candidates. So I'll just show you what it looks like. The graph on the left, so this is tenderness versus marbling, or shear force versus IMF. The graph on the left is basically roughly 5,000 males across our flocks before any genotype data was collected. So you can see quite a tight cluster for those two traits. And then the graph on the right is once we put those 2,000 genotypes in the analysis, and you can see the data starting to spread out, and the bottom right-hand quadrant is where we want to find these animals. So high IMF, low shear force, so they're going to eat really well. And you can see the number of animals in there has gone up significantly. And so it's really just, I guess, an example of data driving decisions through, creating variation and driving our decisions on which animals to select.
Yeah, okay. No, that's excellent. So I guess at the end of the day, what we've done is by doing this work, we've been able to spread it out so we can better identify the variation that does exist in the population, and we've also been able to identify those animals with a higher degree of accuracy than we would have been able to do otherwise. So I guess to pull all that together, we do know that we have been impacting on the eating quality of lamb with our selection for things related to lean meat yield. It's important for us to continue developing our productivity traits like lean meat yield, but at the same time we want to be able to, as a bare minimum, at least maintain our eating quality performance, if not improve it. So our investment through things like the resource flock is really underpinning that ability that we can start measuring things so we can manage them more effectively. I think that just about brings us to a close on what we had to say, so thank you, gentlemen. I think we still have a few minutes, so are there any questions from the floor? There's a couple of roving mics if they'd like to stand up and make themselves known. Kathleen's got one over here. If you could just let us know who you are and ask a question, thank you.
Craig Carter from Willow Tree. Absolutely fascinating stuff. However, I'm a trader, not a breeder, and as Pete says, it's very difficult to get some feedback for selection when they're dead. Has there any bit work been done on the relationship between, say, for argument's sake, frame score and barrel size? My most sensitive variable is daily weight gain. So they're in the question.
From my perspective, I'd understand your dilemma being a trader rather than a breeder. I think it would probably be best outcomes if you were in a position where you could align yourself with someone where you know what the breeding values going into their breeding program are, so you can answer something like that with a higher degree of confidence. Obviously, phenotypically, I guess, animals with reasonable frame score being a highly heritable trait, we can certainly rank animals reasonably well within a mob on a trait that's particularly high heritability. So by ranking animals on that basis, it will give you some information, but it's not going to be as accurate as having genetic information. We are developing some technologies where we can start using genomic information out in the commercial context. So Flock Profile is out there now as a tool for commercial merino breeders, so they understand the average genetic merit of their flock. We are looking at the possibility of developing that more for crossbred situations. So that technology could actually leave us with the ability to take 20 DNA samples from that mob, come up with an overall average breeding value for all of the main production characteristics for that flock of animals or for that mob of animals. So we can start making some of those decisions with a bit more information behind it, but that is something that's in the development pipeline at the moment.
Damien Jensen, East Gippsland, Victoria. Victoria's at 17% MSA is very much out of step with the rest of the states. What's the reason for that? And does it have anything to do with the high proportion of dairy cattle there?
Throw that to Sarah.
I will defer that question if I could for after I finish talking and these gentlemen depart the stage, we'll throw back to the MSA team. So I'll put them on notice to answer that question at the end of that talk, if that's okay with you.
There's one there, one out the back.
Who we got? One with Kath?
I'm Trish Worth. I'm here with my fellow directors from Herefords, Australia. We're very interested, of course, in everything you've been talking about. And I note that you've mentioned nutrition as well as genomics. Have you considered doing, or is it at all, in your view, relevant, the epigenetics that will no doubt be involved at some stage?
Yeah, really good question. I think this the lot feeding industry are in for an interesting time over the next couple of years with a lot of, compromised nutrition early in life. Of calves as you drive around this area right up through Queensland. So look, the ability to quantify the epigenetic effect is a really expensive question. We know it exists. How to quantify it and how to make use of that information, and going into which feeding program or which market is the complex bit. So it'll be there. Now's probably a good time to look at it if we're ever going to invest in that research.
And just to add to that, the other reason why we look at continually refreshing those reference populations is we know that genes in the population change over time. So we continually look at refreshing the information that we've got coming through from the reference populations to reflect current genes and what that means for animals' performance. One very quick last question before we should vacate the stage.
Thank you, Richard Doherty. Just a quick question on, with this genetic movement to shear force and IMF and your eating quality and putting consumer at the front line of that, do you think that that may lead to a change where in the selling of animals you're selling them more on quality than on age and their dentition?
Yeah, thanks Richard for your question. It's the industry's goal is certainly the implementation of the Meat Standards Australia lamb pathway for cuts-based grading in lamb, so individual measurement of lamb. That's my challenge also, is to be able to measure the IMF in each individual lamb so that program can be rolled out. So we're really at the moment being held back a bit by our ability to use a technology to measure IMF in lambs at line speed. But we've got to be in front of the game. Technology will do that for us at some point in time, and then we'll flick from just getting paid on kilos and some palpated fat to actual yield and quality. So it'll be, we're futuristic looking here.
Okay, that brings us to a close, I believe. So we will hand back over to Sarah and the MSA team. If you could please help thank my colleagues.